Tariffs are destructive, but they're also distracting. Right now, Republicans in Congress are preparing what is possibly the most expensive piece of legislation in U.S. history. They're not taking hearings. Apparently, they're not taking our calls, and they're trying to pass with simple majority a $4.6 trillion tax cut. Now, whatever you think of Congress, whatever you think of taxes, this is a squandered opportunity for America to make meaningful economic investments. And if you can give me a few minutes of your time, I think I can convince you of the same. So if we don't know what's in it, how do we know what it cost? Well, for context, in 2017, Republicans passed a $1.9 trillion tax cut called the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. It was so expensive that they couldn't make permanent the changes to the tax code. They had to have them expire after 7 years. In 2025, all of the household tax cuts that they had passed will revert back to 2016 law. Well, they don't want that to happen. They want to make those tax cuts permanent. And since we already know what's in them, the Congressional Budget Office was able to estimate just how much it would cost to make those tax cuts permanent, and it's $4.6 trillion. Now, the bill itself might end up being less because if they do, as they said that they'd like to do, and cut, up to $1 trillion from Medicaid and food stamps, the total bill would come up to 3.6, but the tax cuts themselves cost $4.6 trillion. Maybe they'll find $1 trillion worth of pay-fors by cutting Medicaid, but it won't change the cost of the tax cut. It'll just change the cost of the legislation. Even for the federal government, $4.6 trillion is a considerable amount of money. One way that I show this, and I wrote a newsletter about this morning through my newsletter, Kedits, it's called Nobody Wants This. One way that I show this is I give you comparable estimates for other, potential policies that Congress could pursue. So, for example, universal paid family and medical leave, which means, you get sick, your parent gets sick, your child is born, your child gets sick, you get 12 weeks off of work paid for. Starting up that program would cost $200 billion. If we wanted free universal childcare for ages 0 to 5, it would probably cost around $500 billion. It hasn't been scored directly, but Biden's Build Back Better had free preschool for 2 years and capped 0 to 3 childcare cost, and that came in at around 350. So plus it up to 500. And what if we wanted to give every school child in the US who's at a public school free breakfast and free lunch? I mean, the biggest argument for doing that, it is the cheapest way we have ever found to buy higher test scores, because believe it or not, hungry kids don't pay attention or do well in school or do well on tests. Well, right now the federal government spends about $250 to cover about half of kids, so double it and assume that free school breakfast and lunch would cost $500 billion. Now, the biggest ticket item here is the fully refundable and expanded child tax credit. If you remember in 2021 in the American Rescue Plan, we expanded an existing tax credit that goes to parents if they have high enough income and if they have a high enough tax bill, they get money for their kid. Well, in 2021, we just gave it to all parents and all kids and said, if you have a kid, you're going to get about $3,000 a year distributed monthly to help pay for your kid. It lifted 3 million children out of poverty. And of course, at the end of the year, we took those 3 million kids and we dumped them back in. We could make that a permanent policy for 1.6 trillion. Now, if you add these four things together, you come to a total of $2.8 trillion, exactly half of what the tax cuts will cost. So, universal paid family leave, universal childcare, universal school lunch, and a reduction by half in child poverty that forestalls the deleterious effects of growing up poor for 3 million children. And that will cost half of what this tax cut is going to cost us. What's really fascinating about that number of 2.8 trillion is that is also almost exactly what Congress owes Social Security. Social Security has a trust fund that's invested as treasury bills. Congress owes Social Security $2.8 trillion, and they have to pay them back. So, for the cost of this one tax bill that they are trying to prepare, you could make the single largest investment in children that the U.S. has ever made and pay back what Social Security is owed, and you would still have almost about $100 billion left over total. I mean, this is a remarkable amount of money. And think of the consequences of making a $2.8 trillion investment in children. Put that on the runway for 20 years. See what they can do. I mean, this is why I'd say it's a squandered opportunity. And maybe you don't care about children. That's totally fine. I understand. But, Think of what $4.6 trillion could do for housing. Think of what $4.6 trillion could do for health insurance. Think of whatever it is that is the hardest economic part of your life, and imagine what $4.6 trillion can do for it. It would be more than a tax cut could ever do. How do I know that? Well, we have been here before, 7 trillion times before, actually. We have passed 4 tax cuts this century, each in a Republican Congress, that have totaled $7 trillion. You can read them here and in my newsletter: 1.26, 3.5, 3.6, 1.9, $7.1 trillion total in tax cuts this century. Now, you can't spend $7 trillion and not have a pretty good idea of what it does. And I actually testified in front of Congress, in front of the House Ways and Means Committee, about exactly this, and pointed out to them that the tax cuts were relatively ineffectual at moving economic growth. I mean, they are, kind of always put as this, we have to have tax cuts in order to grow the economy. But even the nonpartisan research bureau that serves Congress, called the Congressional Research Service, they have told Congress unequivocally this did not boost the economy. It was 0.2% GDP growth boosted by the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And so what I said in my testimony was, this is ineffectual and expensive legislation, and we know why, and we can do better by the American people. Now, you might like paying less in taxes. I'm sure we all do, but there's 155 million household filers in the US. To give 155 million household filing units money is incredibly expensive. So even when they cut taxes to an enormous dollar amount, it doesn't actually change your taxes that much. One way that I show this in the newsletter is I look at the difference in marginal rates, or the difference in effective tax rates for various income groups, from the top 1.1% here to the bottom 50% here. If you can't read it, all you need to know is that, 1, we have a progressive tax system, and 2, everybody pays less in 2021 than they did in 2001. Well, you can put that to a dollar amount and say, all right, their average tax rate went down by 2.4 points. They make $3.8 million. How much money are they saving on taxes? And I calculated that for every single income group here. So yeah, I mean, if you make at least $3.8 million, you're getting 90 grand at least back from the federal government. That's a sweet chunk of change. If you make more than $680,000, you're going to get back somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000. If you make more than $250,000, you might be getting a few $1,000s back, maybe even up to $5,000. But for the bottom 95% of Americans who make under $250,000 a year, you're talking at most around $1,000. That is what 4 tax cuts totaling $7 trillion have gotten you. They've gotten you about $1,000 back in your tax bill on average. Now, this isn't predictive, this is illustrative. I'm trying to show you just how expensive tax cuts are to barely move the needle on an average tax rate. I'm not trying to sleep on $1,000. I'm just saying that $1,000 in economic relief through lower tax bill is more expensive to provide than, say, a cure for your childcare bill, a cure for your school lunch bill, a cure for your housing bill, a cure for your health insurance bill, whatever it is. I mean, I put up children, but you can imagine that it applies to other areas of the economy too. The problem with tax cuts and the idea that they're relief is that the relief is more expensive than the solution. We should just solve the problem. I mean, I think what it comes down to for me, and what these 4 prior pieces of legislation that total $7 trillion show you, is that for Republicans, tax cuts are a solution in search of a problem. First, we were so overburdened and we didn't have investment, so we had to cut taxes. And then we had to grow the economy and cut taxes. And then we had to provide economic relief and cut taxes. It doesn't matter what the problem is. They want to cut taxes, and they are looking for the problem that it can solve. Good public policy, effective policy design, starts with the problem and works backwards to the solution. You cannot look at someone's child care spending and say they need to pay less in taxes. You wouldn't look at their housing bill. You wouldn't look at their mortgage or their rent or their health insurance or anything and say, what we need here is $1,000. What we need here is a slightly lower tax rate. Economic problems require economic solutions, and tax cuts are not it. It will be the most expensive piece of legislation in U.S. history. It will throw $4.6 trillion into the economic wind, and it will not make a difference on the line items that matter to you. Even if it's going to happen, we're going to have to reverse it one day, because these problems will still be there waiting for you and waiting for Congress to solve.